Welcome back, folks. Today we're going to make a still life drawing. We're going to focus on not just each object and the way it's affected by light and shadow, but the relationships between the objects. So positive and negative space, different overlaps, and looking at the light and shadow shapes themselves as elements in their own right. So this drawing should be a culmination of all the skills we've been working on so far. We're starting off with some straight line construction, getting an envelope shape, just trying to figure out where these objects fit on the picture plane according to the photo reference. I encourage anyone who's up for the challenge to set up your own still life. You can pay attention to this video and follow along, but if you want to set up your own still life, make your own drawing using what I'm doing here, just pay attention to how the objects might be grouped together, how the space between them creates different kinds of relationships. Especially how the light is going to create a light and shadow pattern. So the light source here was just the late afternoon sun coming through a window. So it's very direct, hitting those objects harshly, creating really stark shadow shapes, as you can see, like especially behind the pumpkin on the wooden block. But also in the fabric, the shadow shapes are very clear cut, and that's going to make it easier to set up a map of those shapes and think about how that can move us around the composition, which is part of what I'm working on here. I'm not trying to copy everything I see in the photo, I just want to take what's useful. If you're setting up your own still life arrangement, think about how the shadows can link the objects together. So even though it's mainly these three objects, 4 if we count the wooden block, they're not touching each other, but they're all interacting in different ways. Even though the pumpkin isn't touching the apple, the cast shadow on the wooden block is overlapping with the apple. The lemon is connected to the wooden block. There's negative space between the lemon and the pumpkin that our eye can pass through, that those angles, that stark white of the background lining up with that cast shadow behind the pumpkin creates a dynamic sense of movement, I think. So if you're setting up a still life, don't just drop a bunch of objects somewhere in the middle of your frame without really thinking about it. Pay attention to the light and the shadows that are created by the light source. Definitely be aware where the light is coming from. If there's more than one light source, that might make it a little bit trickier. Something you might want to think about is isolating the light, or thinking about how reflected light is going to be created and how you can use that to your advantage. Because the camera was so focused on the light shapes here and capturing the detail and the texture, getting hit with direct light, we don't get too much information inside of the shadow. So I'm just trying to stay light and soft and loose and general. I'm trying to not just see the whole picture. I want to see the whole picture plane all at once and get the proportions as accurate as I can. Using different comparative measurements, trying to get everything in the right place. Trying to get the arc of that pumpkin right. One of the hardest parts about making any kind of drawing or painting is making a habit out of backing up and looking at the picture as a whole unit. It's really tempting to just get sucked into one area and make it as detailed as possible. I think when people are in the beginning stages of learning to draw, capturing lots of detail is something that's applauded, something to strive for. Just know that you can always layer more details and more complexity on top of what you already have. But if you rush into the details and they end up being in the wrong spot or with the wrong amount of light or shadow, it's harder to go back and make a fundamental change. So I'm using the brush here to soften everything I have. I'm still kind of negotiating where all of these contour lines are going to land. I'm paying close attention to the photo, but I'm also paying attention to my drawing itself as a composition and how it might be a little bit different from the photo. Even if I'm not necessarily moving anything around, I'm certainly going to ignore things. There's a weird fold lining right up with the stem of the pumpkin in front of it. I'm going to ignore that. A couple other folds in the fabric that aren't too helpful, but there are some folds in the fabric that are super helpful. And I'm going to turn up the volume on those. They're characters in this picture just as much as these objects I'm drawing. But I'm always open to making a change. Down there where the pumpkin meets the fabric, there's lots of complex little cast shadows running into form shadows. So I'm just kind of going along, picking and choosing what I'm going to keep here. I could just try to copy it absolutely perfectly. But sometimes I think it's important to just be open to trusting yourself and taking what's useful and leaving what's not. That's an important skill in drawing. And it's worth practicing from the start. And so the main chunk of this whole drawing process, as I'm in this like constant state of rediscovery, figuring out what's the absolute best way these lines and shapes and curves can all run into each other. The photo does look pretty good though. Like I set it up, I cropped it a certain way. I think it's a strong composition from the start, but even still, as I'm figuring it out on the paper with my pencil, I'm always open to subtle little changes. So just keep that part of your brain on. I know if this is still new to you, maybe this is one of your first still life drawings ever, it might be a big enough challenge just to make it look realistic. That's okay too. Just know that when people look at your drawing, except for in our class here, they're probably never going to see the thing you were looking at, whether it's a still life you set up right in front of you, or if you're looking at this same photo that I'm looking at. The drawing that you're making is an object in and of itself. So that's why I always say, pay attention to the reference, but pay attention to your own drawing too. And you'll start to notice your drawing will want to do certain things. It'll want certain shapes or lines or corners to land where they keep landing over and over. If you ever find that a certain area just doesn't look right, and so you look deeper, you look more accurately, you take the time to draw it more accurately, something's still wrong. Maybe you add more detail, maybe you add more contrast. It's starting to get overworked. It might not be that thing. If you step back, look at the big picture, it might be something adjacent to that. It might be something in a different part of the picture entirely. If you feel like you're spinning your wheels chasing something and it's just not working out, definitely stand up, take a lap around the house, look at something different for a minute, come back with fresh eyes, but definitely also try and just look at it from further away. Remember that when we step back and look at our picture, in our field of vision, the picture gets a lot smaller because we're further away, so then we can see more of it all at once. When we're up close to it, we can only see pieces of our picture, and our eyes scan around and we never really see the full thing. So if you're learning to, or you're training yourself to see both the forest and the trees, or the stars and the constellation all at once, you got to learn to back up, take the big picture into account, and then you can put the blinders back on if you need to dive into a certain area to get it absolutely perfect. I'm starting to block in some shadows here. Pretty light. This is a 2B General's charcoal pencil, and I'm just putting down like a light mid-tone just to try to unify all the shadow shapes. Not worried about chasing specific values just yet. This is just to get an idea of how the shadow pattern as a whole works compositionally. So in this stage here too, I'm massing in all these shadows, and then I'm going to back up and look at the whole thing. You can't see that in this video, how often I'm stepping away and trying to zoom out, look at the big picture. We call it looking at the big picture. It's actually making the picture smaller. If you're wondering where the shadow shape begins and ends, sometimes it's really clear, sometimes it's not. It's kind of a vague gray area in the form shadow of the pumpkin with those forms and the creases in the skin. Just think of it as a sphere in the beginning. Don't worry about the individual shapes on there just yet. Just like the apple and the lemon, it's doing what a simple sphere is going to do as it turns away from the light. Here I'm using a smaller bristle brush. Just to soften everything and knock back some of that texture. Something we want to think about today are the different textures of the different objects and how we can get that tactile sense of touch and feel just by looking at something, if we can represent it in the right way on the page. So think about how the pumpkin and the apple, the wooden block and the lemon and the fabric all feel differently, and how you might be able to show that with your pencil on the paper. Maybe it's drawing more with the side of your pencil in certain areas. Maybe it's using the point of the pencil to carve out sharper, cleaner lines. And use a paintbrush to move the charcoal around to soften everything and give it like a nice general even tone. I'm going in with the eraser here, pulling out the lightest lights. This is a different eraser. Just like one of those big, chunky white plastic erasers that can really pick up a lot of charcoal. But even as I do this, carving out some of the light shapes, I'm thinking about the composition and the flow of all these shapes, just like I would when I'm holding my pencil. Now that everything's kind of diffused and lighter, and the light shapes are nice and bright and preserved, I'm going to go back in with the pencil and just reestablish those edges, paying more attention to the edges than the values themselves. So thinking about the different kinds of shadows, form shadows and cast shadows, and how that can create different forms and shapes. Remember, a form is more three-dimensional, a shape is more two-dimensional. And I'm using the boundary of the shadow, that line of the core shadow, and following it around, using that as a compositional device to create these different lines and shapes. See, even here on the pumpkin, I can pick and choose some of those lines, thinking about what might lead me through, keep us moving around the picture. All these lines that I'm drawing they're really soft, starting to find more curves and everything, but I'm not going in too dark and deep with any of these contour lines. Mostly soft edges and a couple of more firm edges. Not really putting in any sharp edges just yet. Because even the edges of this wooden block they're not too crispy. Maybe that back edge right there behind that lemon. Maybe the cast shadow of the pumpkin on the wooden block could be sharper, but everything else is softer and kind of rolling away from us. The edge of the apple and the pumpkin and the lemon have it's like a horizon that rolls away from us. It's not a sharp line. Starting to build up the values a little bit more, pushing some of those darks, a little bit of a lost edge down here where the light on the pumpkin meets the light of the fabric beneath it. However small and sharp and dark I can make that connection is going to help that sense of texture and how these things are all overlapping and interacting with each other. Darkening the background here just to give me a sense of context for the values. That's probably the darkest thing in the whole picture, is just this empty void back here. So keep that in mind, whether you're working on this still life with me or if you're working on your own. Be aware of where the darkest dark is as well as the lightest light. That can help create some context for the values. I don't think anything on here is really quite as dark as that background. I can still push this cast shadow in the foreground here where the pumpkin meets that fabric, but it's not going to be quite as dark as the background. Keep squinting, looking at the light and shadow pattern. Keep squinting, thinking about how dark that pumpkin actually is. If you squint, that orange is more of a mid-tone. Even though it has a highlight, that highlight's still not going to be as bright as the light hitting the white fabric. I'd say the light hitting the white fabric is definitely the brightest thing on here. So that'll be the closest to the white of the paper. Everything else has to be a little bit darker, like as a rule. That'll help me build up the form of these objects with tone and shape instead of just outlines. If you feel like your objects are made up of mostly outlines, try and diffuse those a little bit. You can use a brush or an eraser and try and build up the form of the objects with the tone or the gradation of light and shadow. And then inversely, if you feel like your shadows are mostly just like loose rendering that doesn't really, the shadow doesn't feel like it has too much of a body to it, you can push your sense of line in the shadows. So I feel like those two things are often flipped. Shadows can just have like random gradations of like not fully understood rendering here and there, but then the objects themselves can be outlined very clearly. See if you can flip those around. Look for some lost edges on the objects and try and build those up with just a sense of really well understood form, gradations from light and dark. And then you can treat your light and shadow shapes more like elements or characters in the picture in their own right. So that's part of what I'm pushing here. It's partly a design choice. Because when I look at the photo, the shadows don't necessarily have that linear perimeter around them. Especially that cast shadow behind the apple, behind the wooden block on the fabric. I could probably just show that with more of just like a tonal difference, just a change in value versus using an actual line, but I like just compositionally what it's doing. So we want to keep that in mind. Seeing our composition as an abstract arrangement of lines and shapes as much as it's a realistic representation of these objects. We want it to be both. If it doesn't work on an abstract level, it's just going to be like a nicely rendered apple, but not necessarily a strong drawing. So I'm using the side of my pencil to try and manipulate the charcoal and how it relates to the paper to show the texture of the pumpkin. Just trying things out. Might work, it might not. I can always use the brush to smooth things out, and also thinking about how the light is hitting that part of the pumpkin closest to the light source, closest to the sun. And those little sections, those little valleys between those forms on the pumpkin are going to seem darker than they actually are. You can see here I pull out the highlight on either side to create that line between them rather than drawing it. So if you are, in fact, drawing this pumpkin, it's going to be tempting to draw like that cartoon icon of what a pumpkin is with really heavy lines carving out each of those sections or those forms on the pumpkin. Remember, try and just do it with tone and don't sacrifice that overall sense of form that gives it that spherical shape. Those little bumps and crevices we see on the surface they're just that. They're superficial. They're right on the surface. See, here I have to soften these a little bit because they look more like the stripes of a watermelon. So flat graphic stripes on the surface of the pumpkin versus actual two-dimensional form. Sorry, three-dimensional form. I said two-dimensional. So as you can see, I'm still playing around with these forms in the foreground here. Just trying to pick and choose which little light and shadow shapes are best going to serve this composition. There's definitely aspects of the photo that I like, but I'm not going to put all of it in. Maybe if I had a couple more hours, I would, but there's never going to be enough time. Part of the drawing process is knowing that you have to make those choices. Time will always be a limited resource. And when our time gets compressed, so does our way of seeing and thinking and turning it into forms and shapes on the page. It gets distilled or compressed or simplified, or basically it gets translated. If we had an unlimited amount of time, every single one of us could copy this photograph absolutely perfectly. But number one, that's probably never going to happen, but we all have limited amounts of time. But even if it was possible, that sounds boring. We would all have the same exact drawing, and I think that misses the point of all of this. So the fact that time is a finite resource is actually part of what makes us who we are. Never mind, just makes our drawings unique to ourselves. So if you ever get frustrated that there's never going to be enough time, just know that that lack of time is part of what makes our artwork our own. I know that I'm getting to the end of my window of time here to work on this drawing. So all these marks that I'm making, trying to get it right, trying to get it perfect, trying to take those little subtle elements of the fabric in the background and enhance the composition without taking away from the objects. That's a lot of things to do all at once and try and embed in each mark that I make. So I'm going from one mark to the next, trying to be as intentional as I can. So that too is a practice in itself. Asking ourselves, what are we going to do with the time that we have, is really asking ourselves, what is important? I think that's a good skill to have with drawing. I think it's a good skill to have in life. Otherwise, the blinders go on and you keep them on so long you forget that you're wearing them. So keep stepping back, keep looking at the big picture. Take deep breaths. If you're sitting, try and sit up straight. Breathe through your nose. If you get more oxygen to your brain, you're going to make better decisions. I'm working on a countertop here because it's easier to film, but I mostly prefer standing at an easel. It keeps me more engaged and more awake. But take deep breaths. Pay attention to your drawing, to your reference, to yourself. Keep your pencil sharp. That's another thing you don't see in this video. I'm pausing to sharpen my pencil a couple times throughout this process, especially right there as I carve out lines with more of the point of the pencil. That's going to grind it down pretty fast. Otherwise, I'm mostly drawing with the side of my pencil. But remember, sharpen your pencil, sand it down as often as you need with whatever kind of tool you're using. Even in these last moments of the drawing, just trying stuff out compositionally. Maybe a little thumbnail sketch at the beginning would have expedited that process. So, I don't know. I'm not saying it's right or wrong to make those changes at the end of the drawing, but just make sure you're paying attention to the whole composition, the big picture. I'd like to believe that, or I wish I could tell you you will reach a certain threshold and then just render every object to completion in a very linear process, but my process feels less linear and more like an orbit or a revolving door going in circles, slowly getting closer and closer to the center, but never fully arriving. I guess what I'm saying is just stay open to whatever your drawing might want to do. So I'm experimenting with a little bit more of a line back there in that dark corner. Lines have a lot of power. They draw us in, so it felt a little risky to put the line back there away from everything, but I think it helped the composition, help resolve that vague, dark void of a quarter. A little bit of perspective on the ground. I think that's it for me. Have fun with this one. If you're setting up your own still life, please take your time arranging the objects, experimenting with different arrangements. And most importantly, be aware of your light source. I won't say most importantly, maybe that's tied for composition and, think about positive and negative space. But being aware of your light is crucial. If you have direct light like this with clear light and shadow shapes, it's going to be easier. If the light is indirect, like what you might see outside on a cloudy day, that's going to be harder. That's going to be a lot of paying very close attention to changes in value to get that sense of form. If you have a direct light source like this, it's going to be easier. Keep your shadows simple. Use them to guide us through the composition. So experiment with that. Do some thumbnail drawings if you want. I know we're all experts on thumbnail drawings to figure out a composition. Thanks for drawing with me. See you next week.